Today's topic is conflict. If you've got 5 minutes, I've got 5 tips to help you to use conflict to write better stories. Conflict and injecting conflict into your stories is a crucial writing tool, and it refers to a struggle between opposing forces. It's what drives the plot forward. It's what helps you to develop characters. If you've been writing for any length of time, or even if you've just started and people have started to talk to you about what needs to be in your stories, conflict is one of those tools. Using conflict in your stories does 3 things. It creates tension, it raises the stakes, and it keeps the readers engaged. And of course, keeping readers engaged is what we all want when it comes to our stories. And of course, conflict means presenting your characters with struggles. And it doesn't matter if you're writing a novel or narrative nonfiction. Injecting conflict into your story one way or another is going to provide you with that kind of tension that allows readers to hang on every word and wonder what's going to happen next, regardless of the genre you're in. Now, before we get to my 5 tips, let's just look at the kinds of conflict that can be included in a narrative. Everyone thinks about conflict as being 2 characters opposing one another for some reason, but there are many other kinds of conflict as well. But let's just start with that one, character versus character. Now, what does that mean? What it really means is that you have 2 or more characters who have opposing beliefs, opposing goals. For some reason, they are opposing one another, and it can be mental opposition to one another. It can even be a physical confrontation, but it's not always a physical confrontation. So if you have a story where you say, I don't have any fights among my characters, we're not talking just about fighting, we're talking about opposition. The second kind is an internal conflict. This happens within an individual character. The character's emotions, fears, moral dilemmas, they become the kinds of things that within that character's mind, they have a conflict. That's internal conflict. An external conflict is the next kind, and that's the kind where your character is in opposition to something like perhaps fate. These are the kinds of stories that put the character in conflict with something other than another character. Then there's your character versus society. It's when your character is at odds with the norms and conventions of the particular society. And when I think about that, I often think about George Orwell's 1984, for example. That's a terrific example of a character versus society. And then, of course, you have a conflict between character versus nature. When a character has to overcome the forces of nature for some reason or another, this is the kind of conflict that can also be very compelling. And finally, there's character versus technology. This is often the kind of conflict that we find in stories that are futuristic in nature, but not always. But remember, character versus technology is also a kind of conflict. It doesn't need to be a character versus a character. Okay, let's look at 5 tips. Tip number 1, introduce opposing goals. This is the kind of thing when you have a character versus character. The goals of individual characters can be quite different. They could even be working together on something, and then they find that they have opposing goals. For example, one character might want to assist someone else, while the other character wants to exploit them. Those would be opposing goals, even if it's 2 characters working together. Tip number 2, raise the stakes. This may be the tip that you've heard of most frequently. I guess the question then becomes, how do you actually do that? Well, one of the most important things that you have to bear in mind in this kind of thing, in raising the stakes, is that the consequences of whichever option the character chooses become really significant. If the consequences are not significant, then you can't raise the stakes. Tip number 3, use internal conflict. Don't limit your conflict situations to external forces or characters versus characters. Really have a look at the internal life of your characters and look at that internal kind of conflict that can plague characters. They can add complexity. Things like moral dilemmas, for example. When a character is in a situation where they don't exactly know what to do, it's a moral dilemma. That can really be a clear case of conflict. Tip number 4, escalate the tension gradually. Don't rush it. You do this by creating a series of smaller obstacles that grow and grow toward a climactic kind of facing of the major obstacle, no matter what kind of obstacle that is you've placed for your character. Tip number 5, add ambiguity or moral gray areas. This is very interesting. When you have two characters, for example, who are in conflict with one another, by adding ambiguity, you increase the stakes, you increase the tension. What this means is that it becomes less clear to the reader who's right and who's wrong. In some situations, they may see one right and then the other right, or this one's wrong and the other one is wrong. These are the situations where that moral ambiguity allows you to create tension between those two characters that wasn't necessarily there in the first place. Now, although the dictionary defines conflict as an active disagreement between people, it is so much more in the hands of a writer. You can use conflict to really make your stories come alive. Remember, fiction or nonfiction. Happy writing. Subscribe to Write, Fix, Repeat, and maybe I can help you improve your writing knowledge and skills. 5 tips at a time.